Hello, everyone. My name is Emily Farju, and I'm the Earth Day Canada Program Manager for EcoHack-a-City. I'm very happy to be here with you today after a few months without any EcoHack event. I'm joining you from Toronto, and I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that the land I'm joining from is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. This panel today, co-hosted with Halifax Regional Municipality, will address the theme Climate Resilient Retrofits for Residential Buildings, and will explore the role resiliency retrofits have in helping homeowners better prepare their homes and properties for this new climate reality. This roundtable kicks off a 10-hour training for stakeholders in the municipal, business, and nonprofit sector, where they will dive further on the topic and identify new or existing areas where further action with more impact can be taken. The findings of the training will be available on the Earth Day Canada website at a later date, and we will notify you when they are available. For more information on the EcoHack-a-City program and on our other programs supporting municipalities towards sustainability, please visit the Earth Day Canada website. Links will be posted in the chat shortly. All right, I think it's time we get things started. And so without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce your moderator for the next hour and a half, Rochelle Owen, Executive Director of the Office of Sustainability at Dalhousie University. Rochelle has worked in the environment and sustainability field for over 30 years at nonprofit, government, and academic institutions. She uses facilitation, community development, program management, and analytical skills to design programs and involve people in sustainability issues. Rochelle holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Community Health, a Master's in Environmental Studies, and is a lead Green Associate. Welcome, Rochelle, and take it away.
Thank you, Emily. Well, good evening, everyone. I'm pleased to be moderating tonight's panel, and we're joining you here today all across parts of Canada. So it's exciting to have you, and I'm sure many of you are from different parts, including Calgary. So thank you for joining us. This is a Zoom webinar, so that means your cameras and microphones are off, but feel free to use the chat function, and we will be asking for Q&As later on in the panel. So if you do want to ask questions of the panelists, just put them in the Q&A function. And at the end of the 3 panel presentations and a bit of dialogue between the panelists, we'll open up the floor for your questions. And I also want to recognize we're here in Mi'kma'ki in Halifax, and that's the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. The people of the Mi'kmaq Nation have lived on the territory for millennia, and we acknowledge them as past, present, and future caretakers of the land. And so I'm very happy to open our panel with a welcoming speech from Samantha. And just to read a little bit about Samantha's accomplished bio. Welcome, Samantha. Samantha is a climate change adaptation specialist with the municipality of Halifax in Canada and is leading the coastal and resiliency infrastructure actions in the municipality's new climate plan, Halifax. Over the past 10 years, she's worked in academic, nonprofit, and various levels of government in Canada, the Caribbean, Africa, Asia, and Central South America to develop, fund, and implement projects that strengthen our collective ability to address climate change challenges. Samantha developed and led the Canada-wide education coastal communities about sea level rise project and managed a community adaptation funding program in the Canadian Arctic, and is currently focusing on developing comprehensive flood hazard maps for the Halifax area and incorporating resilient retrofits into a municipal retrofit program. So very great to have you here, Samantha. So take it away, and we'll be back.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Rochelle. As Rochelle mentioned, I'm a climate change adaptation specialist with HRM, and I'm working primarily on climate hazards and resilient infrastructure as part of our 2020 Climate Plan Halifax. So in 2019, HRM was the second jurisdiction in Canada to, behind Vancouver, to declare a climate emergency across the country. And our plan, which covers actions ranging from EV strategies to retrofit programs to community adaptation plans, nature-based solutions, was really a response to this climate emergency. And so Halifax, which is a community-wide climate action plan, so it's not just what the municipality is doing itself as an organization, but community-wide, what we are collectively doing to address climate change. It was unanimously approved by council during the beginning of the pandemic, and this was really exciting because it really signaled the importance of climate action across Halifax Regional Municipality. And we are now almost 2 years into the plan. And again, one of these big pieces is around municipality resiliency in both infrastructure and community. So of course, when Earth Day Canada approached us, we really jumped at the opportunity to be able to co-host this public panel and then the subsequent hackathon to really dive into this emerging topic of resiliency retrofits for homeowners. And on that note, I just want to thank all of the panelists and Rochelle, the moderator, in advance for their commitment to this event, and also Emily from Earth Day Canada, who's really been leading and organizing all of this. And lastly, just to welcome all of the attendees. I'm really looking forward to the discussion this evening. And for those of you participating in the training for the coming weeks, I'm looking forward to your participation as well. Thanks so much, Rochelle. Back to you.
Thanks, Sam. So I'm pleased to introduce Alanna, our first speaker. And Alanna is a climate mitigation and adaptation professional at Mantle Developments with over a decade of experience supporting the building sector's low carbon transition. In her previous consulting work, she addressed barriers to energy efficiency implementation in city-owned buildings and industrial operations. Alanna supported the development of the clean tech ecosystem through her work in the nonprofit sector at Canadian startups by implementing carbon utilization technologies in the concrete sector across North America. She began her career as a physical risk consultant and created strategies for commercial industrial operations to mitigate risks from hazards such as climate-related fires and explosions. Through her volunteering work, she researched the disproportional impact of climate change on women in Indigenous Southeast Asian villages and explored adaptation solutions through Indigenous knowledge and nature-based solutions. She has an undergraduate degree in civil engineering and a master's in mechanical engineering from the University of Toronto. So pleased to introduce Alanna, and take it away, Alanna. You have 15 solid minutes.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and I'm really excited to be here. So just give me a second to queue up my deck, and here we go. So the discussion that I'm going to be looking at today is community-centric and operational resiliency design for resilient infrastructure. And just diving right into this, I'm going to kind of parse out this presentation into 4 parts. Of course, introducing the topics, looking at identifying the demographics the demographic identification of your key users, understanding those user needs, ultimately to inform your objectives, and then ultimately using that to translate into what you are going to incorporate into your design. So I feel like Rochelle already covered it, but basically this was a little bit about Mantle and about myself, and none of this is different than what she already explained. So before we get into the discussion, I do want to introduce a bit of nomenclature. So first of all, this discussion is mostly going to be about physical risks. So these are direct risks from physical damage to buildings, infrastructure, and communities due to increasing frequency of acute and chronic stressors related to climate change. So when we're talking about acute shocks, we're talking about discrete weather events, including floods, fires, ice storms, etc. Whereas when we're describing chronic stressors, we're talking about long-term changes. So this is typically conditions from increased droughts, dry seasons, change in annual average precipitation, melting, permafrost, and freeze-thaw cycles. And also one other concept that I do want to introduce as well is the concept of a threshold. So threshold is like when you're thinking about your home, your building, your dams, your roadways. A threshold is the critical limit that where a climate system can respond, or a system that responds drastically when exposed to external risk. So potentially that failing point, resulting in a system's change or in the system changing due into a different stable state. And this is important. This is important because the frequency and severity of our risks is increasing dramatically. And one real jarring statistic is that in terms of just adjusted insurance losses in Canada, the cost of our insurance losses in this particular decade is more, or like roughly equivalent to the summation of the previous three. The discussions that we have about these topics is really important because it's really timely, and we are very much in need of adapting. So there are multiple solutions to approach any of your infrastructure, but it almost seems inherent that the default is to think about how to increase the threshold of your infrastructure, but there's only so many times that we can just build concrete around ourselves. And another solution that's often looked at is moving and like changing your site, but especially in the case of when we're talking about retrofits, that's not always the case. So how do you actually make resiliency accessible to everybody? And like, what if the community that we're designing for cannot change their sites? And what if there's only so much we can do to make your building stronger, make it more flood resilient, make it more fire resistant? Like, how many different ways can we address more? And so this is when we pull ourselves back and start thinking about first principles. So although it's instinctual for us to want to think about the infrastructure ultimately serves a need, and that need is dependent on humans. So in all cases, as you're going through your design, the first thing to do is identify your users, and that might be a business, that might be operations, but it also is worth considering the most vulnerable communities that are impacted by the infrastructure that you are using. From there, you need to identify your objectives. So how can you expect these incidents, these climate events to actually impact these individuals? And how can we form the objectives to meet those needs? And then we move into the fun part, which is actually designing for these different stressors and these risks. So first of all, we need to define what that reaction, like in these kinds of critical events, what's the reaction going to be, defining how our response and how our recovery would be. And then if there's opportunities to design for shelter in place and safe to fail. And I'll get into these in a little bit, but first, let's go back and talking about why it's really important to start talking about our users. And so this is a bit of the research I did from a volunteer perspective with a nonprofit called QSO. And when it comes to climate identification and your risks, the first thing is to actually understand who you are designing for. So we were looking at Indigenous villages in Southeast Asia, and something that is recognized like not only in Southeast Asia, but many rural villages, is the way that climate change is impacting men and women has different consequences. So looking at gender-based impact, generally in these rural villages, men were mitigating their risk by moving from rural areas into urban areas. And the consequences and impact of climate change on these individuals were men generally had higher fatalities. And this was kind of a duo reason of, for some reason, well, I mean, potentially they were out in further areas, potentially they had lower aversion to risk in terms of critical events, but generally the more fatalities were men during flooding and acute shocks. And also furthermore, in terms of chronic and long-term stressors to the systems, especially in agrarian societies, men were also more prone to self-harm and suicide due to climate stressors. Whereas solving for problems in that kind of community would not be equivalent to the adaptation behaviors and solutions around women. And that's because the problems took a different form. So women were more likely to stay. Women generally in these communities generally didn't have the opportunity to move into more urban areas. Basically, how this manifested was they generally were expected to uphold the traditional caregiver roles, but while also taking the roles of the now absent men. Also, on top of taking up these roles, their roles also took longer. So foraging for wood, they would have to go further. Foraging for water, they would have to go further. Sometimes you even need more water to deal with like agrarian activities in their local communities. And so we were finding that these women their reaction and their behavior was taking up gardening, finding new opportunities for collecting forest-based products, seeking nature-based solutions, and finding opportunities to improve the resiliency of their homes because they didn't really necessarily have the opportunities to leave. And so the solution, that being said, it's definitely a need to address the challenges that men were having, but this particular research and the scope of this research was only funded to look at the women's side of this. But the solutions that we were looking at was creating a bank for nature-based solutions and indigenous knowledge that women in multiple communities in the area could share. This could be also finding methods to share knowledge across different dialects, as these were rural communities, and also finding time-saving activities by making certain technologies for wood cutting, farming, and gathering water more accessible. Furthermore, larger structural changes that had to be made was observing the structures around land ownership and barriers for women to be able to potentially procure more desirable land. And of course, this is all embedded by the underlying challenges of education. And so in these kinds of scenarios, taking this back to Canada is how do we take these specific user needs after we understand the people and translate them into our particular projects? So in terms of infrastructure adaptation and resiliency, we often are describing our work as protecting buildings and assets. But to avoid becoming overly prescriptive with our solutions, we always need to go back with what are we actually prioritizing? And so a common or potential narrative that you might get as a risk professional is the stated objective was to protect the generator from the flood. But the actual objective was to maintain power during a flood to supply enough power during the flood to supply the life safety of the tenants and the critical loads. There's two key distinct differences with how we position the two. And so just even looking at Halifax, what makes Halifax valuable? Halifax isn't valuable just because of its infrastructure. It's because people want to be here. And it would not be like if in these parts of the culture and airports supporting the infrastructure, why would somebody protect the infrastructure? And so here is an interesting way to kind of thinking about operational risk. And this is especially in the case of when you can't move your site, is you typically start out with your routine operation. And so that's basically your status quo going through your day by day. And so I will draw you to these two lines, so the minimum operating capacity. And so that is, if you're a business or you're an operation, this is the minimum amount of capacity to be operating in that you still hit your your organization's mission. Whereas the minimum sustainable capacity is like hitting your organization's mission while breaking even per se. So let's just kind of go through this as if we were a hospital during a critical event. So a reaction happens, you're going from like your routine state, and then say your hospital loses energy. There's a reaction and there's time that takes in that reaction. So basically the next step would be initiating the response. And so a response would be hitting the bare requirements for your hospital to actually hit its need. So in this case, after you lose energy, the first two wards to go up would be your emergency ward and your maternity ward. And so that would be like your minimum operating capacity. And then as we go into the recovery, this would be over time, your hospital would be able to bring full capacity across the different wards until you actually come back to the new routine, which might be when you actually start finding yourself opening up to elective surgeries. And so here's an interesting example of an organization that really took resiliency to the next level. So this is 2012 in New York City. You're looking at Manhattan across the water during Hurricane Sandy, when the entire grid went out. And as you might be seeing, that glowing gold building in the distance is Goldman Sachs. Not only did it remain open, but it continued to serve clients. And if you Google this case study right now, the first thing you're going to see is a huge amount of criticism against Goldman Sachs for keeping its lights on because it was considered insensitive. But Goldman Sachs wasn't keeping the lights on. They basically bounced back from their routine, the reaction, and almost went just to below routine again. They almost completely bypassed their operating capacity and your minimum sustainable capacity. So this facility had backup generations, backup Wi-Fi. It had food, it had beds. Their staff never really left the building, and they basically worked straight. Goldman Sachs profit immensely during this time because they were one of the few facilities that stayed in operation, and they weren't just serving their own clients. They were serving the clients across Manhattan that couldn't actually be serviced by other banks. And so meanwhile, in Canada, in terms of communities that we're also serving, and taking this back to thinking about who we're serving through residential communities, is thinking about, we have a plethora of different crises that we're dealing with at once beyond just climate crisis. So we have an aging population crisis, we have a housing crisis, we have a water crisis in some of our rural and Indigenous communities. And so as you're also designing for that part, I'd also like to introduce two concepts, and one is shelter in place and the other is safe to fail. So during an extreme event, shelter in place would be referring to keeping your indoor space safe unless you're told to evacuate. And safe to fail is the engineering concept where if you lose capacity or you're hit by climate risk and something goes wrong, you're still not creating harm for the people within the facility. And so talking about this from a municipal perspective, everything costs money. It costs money to have emergency response. And it costs money to plan for this. It costs money to have a backup system. So in terms of extreme weather events, one of the best ways that municipalities can consider mitigating their costs is also to figure out how retrofitting your buildings or your new buildings can self-recover without intervention. And so by definition, this would mean like your basic needs like food, water, shelter, heat, cooling, etc., would be accessible to the individuals within that first 72 hours after the shock. And so if a citizen can do so, municipal services can become less strained, less expensive, and also your emergency professionals can address the root cause rather than saving individuals. And so a municipality doesn't necessarily have the ability to target every single home. There's choice, then this is a democracy, so you can't really overstep your boundaries. But an interesting way to do is also just to look at your community hubs. And this is a project that we at Mantle were working on with the YMCA here in Toronto, where the YMCA sees itself as community hubs for especially low-income communities and individuals who cannot necessarily withstand these climate shocks. So specifically, some examples would be like dealing with pandemic risks, heat waves, and loss of power during winter storms. And so one of the solutions that they're proposing here, or that they've already implemented in multiple different YMCAs across Toronto, is island energy systems. So they have backup generations. Basically, these backup generations all do work within the facility within existing systems like their pool. So just to clarify, it's not just backup generator. It is a CHP system, which they also use ad hoc for their facilities, but they also have different kinds of elements like electrical vehicle chargers, or they also support this through photovoltaics, energy storage, and a microgrid controller. So with some parting notes and realizing I'm only 1.5 minutes over time. So the first part is really to understand your user. And the second is to create the objectives of your users, so create your objectives with your users in mind. And then as you're designing for resiliency, prioritize shelter in place or safe to fail when you find this possible. So thank you for your time. I really enjoyed being here.
Thank you so much, Alanna. That was excellent, and something we're also thinking about at Dal and doing some planning around all those important concepts of community hub and backup power, not just for our individual facilities, but for the community in general. So thank you for that. So we are going to have a panel discussion after we've completed the remaining 2 panels and open to questions and answer. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce Cheryl Evans. And Cheryl is with the Flood and Wildlife Resiliency Intact Center on Climate Adaptation out of the University of Waterloo. And she leads program development, oversight, and continuous improvement of a variety of initiatives whose primary objective is to mobilize on-the-ground action to improve the resiliency of Canadian homes, businesses, and communities to flooding and wildland urban interface wildfires. Cheryl has over 20 years of community engagement and program management experience in the fields of stormwater management, flood risk mitigation, home energy conservation, and youth environmental education. Cheryl is a member of the FireSmart Canada's Wildlife Resiliency Checklist Education Committee and collaborates with FireSmart Canada to support the development of flood and wildfire resiliency volunteer training programs for the Canadian Red Cross. Cheryl's team is the recipient of the Canada's Clean 50 Top Project Award for 2020. Congratulations. And Cheryl holds a BES in Environment and Resource Studies from the University of Waterloo. Please, Cheryl, take it away.
Thank you. I will try to get my computer to work. All right. How's that look? Okay, great.
Looks great. You're good.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you very much for having me here tonight. I've looked at the 3 different presentations that are being put forward tonight, and I think they really have nice complementarity. So I think they'll all work nicely together. So I'm just going to dive right in. I was very jealous of Alanna's ability to be perfectly on time, so I'm going to try to do the same, which is very challenging. So here I go. Okay, so first of all, I'm just going to go over a quick agenda. We're going to talk about who the heck the Intact Center is, talk about the overview of the challenge and the opportunity related to resilient retrofits. I attended a meeting yesterday on Canada's Climate Adaptation Strategy discussion paper. I wanted to share it because it pulls a lot of these key ideas together. And I wanted to talk about benefit cost ratios of climate resilient buildings and infrastructure, because we have to make the case for doing this kind of thing. And then finally, I want to highlight a few really practical reports and resources and infographics that our center has put together for flood, fire, and heat resilient retrofits to get the discussion going and get people started. So first of all, the Intact Center is an applied climate adaptation research center with a national focus. We're headquartered at the University of Waterloo. We were launched in 2015 with a gift from the Intact Financial Corporation, and we have 2 goals. The one is to change the national conversation about climate change, to go beyond mitigation, to also address climate adaptation. And also to work with residents, businesses, not-for-profits, and governments to improve their resilience associated with climate change and extreme weather events. There's just a little note there that we operate independent of all funders, and we do not benefit from the sale of any products or services. That's really important because we are not an insurer, we are not a government, and it allows us to build trust in communities to do community-based research. So we started out with flood at the home, and then the community scales, and then commercial real estate, etc. But more recently, we've expanded into collaborating with various partners on wildfire, extreme heat, and then pulling all these things together, we started to take a more integrated approach. We now look at how natural infrastructure, health, and capital markets tie across all of these sectors. So first of all, just to put the challenge squarely in front of us and identify what's really going on. In 2019, Canada produced their Changing Climate Report. The main outcomes were that Canada's climate has warmed and will warm further in the future, driven by human influence. Both past and future warming in Canada is on average about double the magnitude of global warming, and our north is actually 3 times the magnitude of global warming. And effectively, warming is effectively irreversible, and that climate change impacts vary by location across Canada. Now, when you're looking at Halifax, I was reading through these impacts going, oh, okay, besides permafrost, I think Halifax and area, the Atlantic region, basically will be dealing with all of these extremes. So in terms of climate impacts, you'll see more extreme heat days and less extreme cold, shorter seasonal coverage of snow and ice, rise in sea level, and it leads to an intensification of certain extremes, including intense rainfall and urban flooding, coastal flooding and erosion, severity of heat waves, and risk of drought and forest fire. And I always like to talk about what else is going on besides climate change. Why are we seeing increased damages to human communities? Well, a lot of it is the choices that we make about where we put our communities and how we build them. So first of all, we've done increased amounts of development in high-risk zones. We have more people and property in high-risk zones. And there are additional human-induced impacts, particularly with wildfire ignitions. Between 50 and 80% of all wildland-urban interface wildfires near communities are due to human-caused ignition. So campfires, cigarettes, chainsaw sparks, etc. The other thing I like to talk about is looking back to see where we've come and how we might have gotten ourselves here. So first of all, we put historically we've approached sort of a command and control approach to natural processes. We've placed communities in high-risk areas with the assumption that engineering solutions can adequately manage risk. But we know that all engineered solutions have tolerances and fail states. And we've also tried to manage wildfires by suppressing wildfires. Unfortunately, it's put an increased amount of fuel on the land, and it's now leading to larger and more impactful fires. We build in floodplains, we dam rivers, and we've removed natural infrastructure, making all these assumptions that we can engineer our way out of problems is a problem in itself. Also, there's a distinct lack of regulation. So resilience is not fully integrated into the National Building Code. And in fact, heat and wildfire don't play into National Building Code at all. There's a little bit of flood irregularly placed in there. And there's a lack of planning and development regulation to limit risk. So we're putting more homes in and values homes and infrastructure at risk without taking precautionary measures. This is another one I like to talk about too, is where we're investing our money, our public money. The majority of public funds are directed to respond directly to, for example, wildfire emergencies, floods, etc. And we put a minimal investment of public funds into prevention. So 95-5 is a commonly heard stat. And by not putting a focus on prevention, we're leaving a lot of unnecessary risk in the system. Something very exciting that I attended yesterday was the launch of Canada's National Adaptation Strategy discussion paper. And I really wanted to bring it up because it is a very innovative and wholesome, fulsome, forward-looking approach that ties in nicely with Alanna's presentation about thinking about who are vulnerable populations, who are our target audiences, how can we work together to understand our risks and to take action to reduce risks. So Canada's National Adaptation Strategy is a shared vision for using an integrated whole of society. That just means everybody put on your boots and let's get working approach to help residents and communities adapt to and prepare for the impacts of climate change. So some of the sample guiding principles that are really beyond basic engineering, which I love, are that they recognize the rights of Indigenous people and they work to advance reconciliation in this country. That we advance social, gender, and intergenerational equity issues. That actions will be informed by science and data, but also that Indigenous knowledge and other diverse ways of knowing will be fully integrated and considered. And that adaptation actions will maximize co-benefits, and we should avoid maladaptation. We don't want to make something better adapted for, say, flood, but make it far worse for fire. So I like this diagram, the holistic integrated approach. So when you're thinking of your designs, I would love it if you could start to think about how these different factors play in together. So the timing of report was out yesterday, the launch of this discussion paper, and they'll be looking for public input about how we can actually get an on-the-ground strategy realized in Canada. We have until the end of this this summer to provide feedback, then they're going to release the strategy. So that's really important, really exciting, and actually is getting a lot of attention internationally because it's very well informed by the Sendai framework and other United Nations principles. So we have to start with why. Why is it important? One of the biggest things about investing in flood, wildfire, bridge and extreme heat best practice guidance. CSA will talk a little bit about some of our guidance documents that have been developed within the last 5 years, which are amazing. They pay. Resilience pays. They say an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, while also building wildfire resilient homes pays $6 for every dollar invested. Investing in flood resilient buildings pays $11 for every dollar invested. Doing highways and bridges, highway bridges to be climate resilient is a 9-to-1 ratio, and overall it is a 12-to-1 ratio for investing in resilience. And why does it matter? So yeah, we're going to get some, it's a good investment, but why does it matter? Overall benefits to communities include increased physical protection to homes, businesses, and infrastructure, but improved business continuity, like we heard with the bank that was in New York City. Also jobs. People would like jobs. This will provide sustainable, great, innovative jobs, especially for young people. Physical and psychosocial health protection, improved ecosystem health, and we can maintain affordable insurance premiums. In Canada, we have for-profit insurance companies. They need to have balances that make providing insurance available or reasonable. Now, these calculations do not even include the benefits of doing retrofits, the benefits of integrating natural infrastructure into designs, or the impacts of reducing risks of these cascading effects that we saw, particularly in BC last year. Get a heat dome, which leads to a fire, which leads to flood and landslides. Those are not even included in those amazing benefit cost ratios. So we have just an example of a freshly cooked national guide for wildland urban interface fires, very practical. You'll be able to look at that if you would like for your design principles. The exciting thing about this report I want to bring up is that they looked at not only new builds, but also retrofits, and they looked at the benefit cost ratio of the construction of the home itself, but also the gardens, because in wildfire resilience, landscaping plays a big role in ignition probability. So the big picture is it's always the biggest bang for the buck to invest in new home construction that's wildfire resilient versus existing homes. Always more beneficial to invest in high hazard versus lower hazard homes. And the bigger bang for the buck is always landscaping versus non-combustible construction. And that working at the community scale really has economies of scale and improves benefit cost ratios by 2 to 3 times. So these are all good news things. What we've done at the center is we've had various different members sit on CSA committees and national committees that are looking at guidelines and standards. And what we've done is taken some of the best practices from these standards and we've converted them into really simple, user-friendly documents that can be started as igniting conversation for practical things that people can do if they already have homes and they're thinking of making some updates. It provides a cost-effective sort of stepwise approach. So we've got one that we partnered on with Fire Smart Canada to talk about wildfire resilience, and it talks about maintenance in the yard and pruning and cleaning up and taking care of your home. Just the cleaning up more than anything, because it's the fine materials that are what are often igniting from embers that float through the air and then start this process of lighting things on fire. Completing simple upgrades and then completing more complex upgrades, but you can see the jump in price is quite expensive. So you can see that people need to understand the prices so that they can save up and arrange loans, etc. We worked with the Canadian Home Builders Association, Fire Smart Canada, and Canada Wildfire, which is an online publication. And we took the wildfire guide, that was it's a 200-page guide, and we created just a checklist for anybody who's thinking of building, renovating, or doing landscaping. And it's a user-friendly checklist. It's also got an appendix at the end that has the very best practices for home and landscape construction that can then very easily be turned into local bylaws, which are also important. We did our own research of 500 homes, found out what the key risks are at homes and things that really need to be done to reduce risks. And we married those, with a national guide for basement flood protection as well, and created a 3-steps document, again, going from simple maintenance items, simple upgrades, and more complex upgrades. We recently completed a coastal flood resilience report that really focuses on considering integrating a landscape scale approach to managing coastal flood and risk, and also looking at green and gray infrastructure and ways to combine, and also work together as a community to reduce resilience, improve resilience. We've just recently put out an extreme heat resilience guide that looks at non-structural green infrastructure and gray infrastructure options for managing risk, and that's really exciting in the built environment. You can dive into that as well. And if you want to find all of these resources, you can go to intactcenter.ca. Those reports and the infographics I was talking to, they're on the climate adaptation recent reports page. And if you want to dive into how-to videos and simple resources for home flood, you can just go to our flood page at homefloodprotect.ca. And again, I'd love it if when you are doing your designs, if you can take a look at this integrated approach that was presented by the National Adaptation Strategy to see how you can work together with various players and solve multiple problems at the same time.
Thanks so much, Cheryl. A lot of great resources there. I know personally I'm going to check those out later tomorrow. Maybe not tonight, but tomorrow. So thank you very much. Our third and last speaker, and not and all our speakers are very accomplished, and as well as Vanessa. So I'd like to introduce Vanessa, everyone. Vanessa Mitchell is a project manager in environment and climate change team of the CSA Group, a professional engineer with 15 years of experience developing national and international standards ranging in topic from construction and infrastructure to environment, social, and governance. As the international committee manager for ISO TC 207 on environment, Vanessa was responsible for the Keystone Standards, ISO 14001, environmental management systems, and ISO 140 and 64, GHG inventories and management. Currently, Vanessa is leading an initiative in collaboration with the Canadian commercial real estate sector on the development of a climate resilience framework. Her portfolio also includes areas involving transition finance, climate adaptation, and natural capital. Vanessa is currently pursuing a master's degree in corporate sustainability and innovation at Harvard University. So welcome, Vanessa.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. And it's been really interesting watching the other slide decks. It's good to see that we have similar, hang on a second, I'm just getting my screen set up.
You're looking good.
Wait a sec. The mice are running slow here. Okay. It's good to see that we have similar sort of definitions for things too. This is a good sign. Anyways, so as Rochelle mentioned, my name is Vanessa Mantle. I work for CSA Group in the Standards Development Division. And we'll be speaking to you today about CSA Group and our role in climate resilience and adaptation, or what we've done so far. Please see the agenda right there, which I just described. Just go through a little bit about who CSA Group is, talk about what we've done, what standards we're developing that supports climate resilience, and then speak about some of the projects under development. So first, let's get into who CSA Group is. So CSA Group is over 100 years old and Canada's largest standards development organization. We're comprised of two organizations, Standards Development and commercial subsidiaries, which are testing, inspection, and certification, with the Standards Development Organization being not-for-profit. We're a leader in standards research, development, education, and advocacy. The technical and management standards developed by our members improve safety, health, the environment, and economic efficiency in Canada and beyond. At CSA Group, we excel in addressing emerging complex issues and technologies. We're headquartered in Toronto and have a global presence. We operate in over 13 countries and have 39 labs and offices around the world, including Canada, the US, and facilities in Europe and Asia. Today, CSA Group employs 2,000 people spread across our standards and testing, inspection, and certification business units. The mission of CSA Group's Standards Development Organization is to enhance the lives of Canadians through the advancement of standards in the public and private sectors. The CSA Group Standards Development Organization facilitates the development and maintenance of over 3,000 standards in 12 areas of focus. The development of our standards is the result of our 10,000 volunteer experts drawn from government, industry, academia, consumer groups, and others who sit on over the 1,000 committees that we have. In Canada, we are accredited by the Standards Council of Canada, the SCC, and in the US, we are accredited by ANSI, American National Standards Institute. And actually, yes, that is me in the picture, in case anyone noticed. I didn't realize I'm wearing the same top. CSA Group provides services to businesses, industries, and consumers worldwide. Within our 12 areas, we cover over 54 sectors of technology, including construction and infrastructure, environment and natural resources, healthcare, management systems, nuclear, occupational health and safety. I'm just naming a few. I'm not going to go through the whole list. CSA partner with industry, regulators, government, academia, and consumers to leverage the combined experience of volunteer members to develop standards using a balanced matrix through our accredited process of building consensus. We also provide training, skills development, and certification to thousands of people each year. Some of the key principles that CSA groups stand by in the development process include an open and inclusive process where any stakeholder affected by the relevant standard is represented. Members develop the technical content of the standard. They bring the expertise, experience, and the wisdom. Decisions are determined by consensus. This principle permeates all our activities in various ways and to varying degrees of formality. To the fourth bullet, standards are voluntary. All standards or codes developed are voluntary. It's when regulator chooses to reference that standard or code in their legislation that the standard becomes mandatory. Over 50% of CSA standards are referenced. And when standards are not referenced or made mandatory, they're often recognized as best practices. Those people involved are the technical committees, and the technical committees are typically comprised of 4 or more interest groups. And this depends on the subject matter, ranging from government to researchers, regulatory authorities, business interests, professional services, and/or general interests. The membership on the technical committee is organized using a balance matrix, as I mentioned earlier, which ensures no one group is able to severely outnumber or outweigh the other groups. This process ensures that decisions made by the committee are non-biased and reach through a consensus process. So that's a little bit of background about CSA and our standards development process. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the standards we've developed in the climate resiliency area or climate adaptation part of sector. So as you can see on the slide, there are several standard solutions CSA have developed with the Northern community stakeholders to address the climate adaptation concerns for the extreme North. These standards have a wide range in topics, and they include management of solid waste sites, managing snow loads for buildings, and community drainage systems, to name a few. There's more. And then here is our listing of many climate resilience standards that CSA have developed related to water management, covering topics including community flood resilience, stormwater management, natural and nature-based solutions. The standards on this list are predominantly voluntary, with a few of them becoming referenced in at the municipal level in municipalities. And those are the ones related to community flood resilience right now. And just to allude to what Cheryl had mentioned, Intact Center have been involved in many of the, have been part of committee members in many of the development of these standards. And then additionally, we've also embedded climate adaptation into existing standards, which are related to construction and infrastructure. And many of these standards are currently referenced in the National Building Codes. So now I'm just going to talk a little bit about projects under development right now in climate adaptation and resilience. So this, I'm not going to speak to this because this is the same definitions, and I'm happy to see that Alanna had on acute risks and chronic risks, and where climate resilience requires adaptation measures to address these risks. So you can read the slide there, it's the same definitions, which is good, it's standardized. But there is a need, there is a need to reduce the impacts of climate change on our infrastructure and society, as we have all just agreed to, I think, to develop timely, practical risk-reducing changes to building infrastructure in order to improve the Canada's real estate resilience to accelerating climate shocks and stressors, and to encourage landlords and building managers to effectively and demonstratively invest in de-risking measures. And as we've said throughout this presentation, failure to act or incorrect adaptation pose specific and systemic risks to investors, businesses, property owners, governments, individuals, society at large. In Canada, between 1983 and 2008, the average catastrophic insurable losses were 400 million annually. And then if we jump over to 2014 to 2019, that amount tallied up to nearly 2 billion annually. Very similar to what Alanna had presented. Rising insurance claims will result in rising costs of risk, insurance premiums affecting operational expenses, and in extreme cases, assets or properties will become uninsurable against certain risks. Property managers are largely operating in a reactive method to solve for ad hoc climate-related impacts to assets. There is merit and value to developing proactive de-risking measures. Inaction will inevitably result in further climate-related impacts to properties and building repairs and decreased returns on investments for investors. So how do we deal with this? So CSA are currently working in collaboration with several organizations in the commercial real estate sector, including Aon, BOMA Canada, JLL, and RailPac, to explore potential solutions, including the development of a user-friendly climate resilience framework intended for building owners and operators. This will involve the formation of a CSA Technical Committee on Climate Resilience, and the committee will be populated with representatives and experts from the real estate sector in a balanced matrix, and will not only collaborate, but also include organizations who are developing climate resilience and adaptation resources right now, including Intact Center. In addition, CSA Group will develop training and education tools needed to enable easy uptake and the use of this framework and its associated checklists, potential checklists that might be in it. But before we get started on the committee work, research is needed in this area. Upon conducting our outreach, when I say our, I'm talking about the stakeholders I mentioned earlier and myself. We've been doing outreach and speaking with various other stakeholders in the industry to find out, what's the need, or what are the needs out there. And we learned that there are many initiatives in the marketplace. As you can see, here is a listing of all the current initiatives in the marketplace related to climate adaptation or resilience. So there's also many opportunities, as the sector is quite wide ranging from commercial office space to industrial to residential. And so CSA are embarking on a research project with two main objectives: to seek an understanding of Canada's real estate sector with respect to gaps in climate adaptation and resilience assessments and measures. And the outcome of that will be a landscape review, identifying the gaps and making recommendations. And these recommendations will be put forward to the technical committee so that the technical committee will be able to have a prioritized laundry list of activities to get started on. The intention is that the priority will be the framework, but they just want to do the research to make sure that they're addressing the right priority first, the best priority first, I should say. So in summary, as you can see here, as I've shown so far, CSA are involved in many initiatives and are working with a wide range of sector stakeholders, supporting the journey to become more climate resilient. I kept my slide deck short because I'm at the end. So I hope that worked for everybody. Thank you very much for having me, and I look forward to hearing more.
Thanks so much, Vanessa. That's great. And so now we're going to transition into a panel, a couple of questions we have for the panel, and we do have two questions from our audience members. So we'll kick us off with a few questions for our panel. And just in summary, just my reflections on our panel today, rapid climate change is here, and we can see the impacts already, and it's going to change more. And so that is shown in our presentations here today with real weather and climate impacts, but also in things like cost insurance. That's what, and we see some of the impacts of fire, warmer, wetter, wilder kind of scenarios, and that's playing across Canada. And, it struck me that a couple of you also talked about the outcomes being different on different people, right? How people can adapt will depend on a number of things, how many resources they have, their gender, so where they're located in the world. So, this notion of adapting using individualistic perspectives, but also community centric, I thought was also interesting as well. And so, and we have a lot of resources the panel have put forward here, from technical guides, educational centers, and just a wealth of work being done also at the CSA standards. So thank you for that, and very inspiring to see all the work that's taking place and we can share with everyone. So I had, just to kick it off, I have a couple of questions here, but I have a question for the panel. Emily, I hope you don't mind, I'll kick us off. And I know some of you, everybody talked about nature-based solutions as a climate certainly it's a mitigation opportunity and adaptation. But we also notice fire and how you do, your landscaping and your natural environment. So what's the intersect between natural solutions and biodiversity and fire risk management? So can you still increase biodiversity, increase natural solutions, and not create fire hazards? So I'll open it up to the panel.
Should I say something?
Please.
Okay. So I think it's important to recognize that Indigenous people have used fire to manage landscapes from time immemorial. So from the last glaciation, which was 10,000 years ago, they've used cultural burning practices to sort of figure out, natural succession processes, going from, say, a grassland that would eventually be early succession trees to a major pine forest, or evergreen forest. They've been using cultural burning around their communities to do things like make sure that they are burning off species they didn't want, getting plants that were good for medicine and food, and attracting animals that they wanted to hunt. So what they were doing with cultural burning was sort of creating a disruption to the natural system to prevent the maturation of the forest, like to mimic the natural processes. And in that way, it served them culturally, it gave them food, but also protected them from wildfire damage. So right now, wildfire managers are looking to Indigenous people, to fire keepers, knowledge keepers, to understand more about their traditional practices. And they're also using Western science to look at prescribed burning. So one of the things that was talked about in the National Adaptation Strategy is to integrate Indigenous knowledge with other knowledge, including Western knowledge. And there's a saying that's two-eyed seeing, which talks about using Indigenous knowledge and Western knowledge to come up with solutions. And something that I thought was really cool when I heard a prescribed burning specialist talk about learning from Indigenous people was that not only did they burn to burn off undesirable species, they also did it to create smoke, to create layers of smoke over spawning grounds when it got really hot, to keep the temperatures cool so that the eggs could continue to develop and not get fried. So there's a lot of cultural heritage knowledge and new knowledge that's being braided together right now. It's a really exciting topic. And one last thing is, in Australia, they are now giving out burn permits in return for carbon offset credits, because reducing fuel loads on the landscape actually helps to reduce these massive fires that create a lot of air pollution. So there's so many exciting things going on in that area.
Okay, thanks, Cheryl. Alanna?
Yeah, I mean, I'm excited that Cheryl took this because she said all these things a lot more eloquently than I could have. But one thing I did want to highlight too is, like, she did mention that there's interest in this in Australia. I've heard of some really interesting work out in BC around this, but this is like, it's almost like controlled burning is kind of like dumplings, where every culture in the world has some sort of form of a dumpling. Controlled burning is kind of like that across the world as well, where it's like, these are topics that came up in my research. We had precedent of this kind of of having controlled burns, or I'm sorry, you call them cultural burns, but yeah, cultural burns in various African nations. And so going to Indigenous practice, like, it's in a way, some of the research, when we were doing some of the research in Southeast Asia, the reverse engineering part was deconstructing policies that otherwise would have inhibited controlled and cultural burning from happening. So, and ultimately to enable those kinds of like cultural aspects to return when in the past, for one reason or another, they were considered taboo.
Interesting. Thanks for that. We're going to come back to the panel and ask each other if they have some questions. But before we do that, I'm going to mix it up here. I'm going to ask a question from one of our audience members. And so the first question you hear is, how can you gain people's trust to participate in changing, and how do we shift people away from ego to eco-friendly? Anybody want to weigh in there?
Give it a go.
Go ahead, Vanessa.
I'll kick it off, and then Cheryl, please jump in. I think the easiest way to change people is to change people's minds, is to educate them, is to show them, you know, how their own personal situation is being affected by climate change. I mean, that's the, in my, winning their heart over on the situation is usually the quickest and the best way to go. But Cheryl, if you have, please go ahead.
Sure, thank you. So we have engaged a variety of communities, and one thing that's always critically important, I think, is the concept that when you go in to provide support to a community, you're being invited in. The community has a history of say challenges with flood, with fire. They've got community leaders, they've got vulnerable people, they've got high risk areas. So when you go into a community, you learn the story of the community. And when you're going to be engaging residents, is critically important to gain the trust and the collaboration of key stakeholders that are trusted within those communities. So if you've got a leader within the YMCA or a local politician or a local hardware store who is really very interested in this topic and is willing to spread the word for you, that's always far more effective to use those existing social channels than it is for Cheryl, some unknown nerd person, to come and talk to people. The other critical important thing is to have a discussion with people. I don't like to use the word education because it's sort of like reminds me of like a Bible salesman or something. You're trying to sell an idea. And the way I like to think about it is, you know, to start the conversation. So if I talk about protecting homes from wildfire, I like to find out what people care about in their homes. If they worry about wildfire, how they think a wildfire starts, and then to have a discussion about what the research says, and then to think about what are some things that they might be interested in doing to reduce their risk. And that's the approach that we take with Canadian Red Cross. It's a discussion, and you're always learning just as much from them as they are from you. And if you take an approach that you come to teach, then look out. The people don't like to be told what to do. So there's a lot of interesting things, and it's also really important to measure your impacts to see if anything that you're doing is working. Find out why people are getting stuck and what's going to help them to get beyond stuck. Ask them what supports they need and work with them to develop those supports. So a very much a community-centered approach is what we use in our research. Thanks, Cheryl.
So I'm going to ask a question regarding the municipality. Maybe I'll walk through the different panelists. So, so this is for all of you. What is the number one action that Halifax Regional Municipality could take to support the different sectors, nonprofit, community, business, in accelerating buildings' climate resilience? So Alanna, you want to kick us off? Sorry to give you the first the first reaction.
I'll remember this. I'm just kidding. Yeah. So I mean, it does kind of dovetail very. It does dovetail really nicely into what Vanessa and Cheryl already said, and that one is instinctual, stakeholder engagement. because none of these are like it's a two-pronged element where nothing is understood and nothing can establish a form of governance without bringing in those communities. I can come in as nerd person number 2, Alanna, and say, hello, this is what we're doing. But people are more likely to come into your process with you if they co-create this solution with you. And like, I'm Calgarian. I live in Toronto, but I will always identify as a Calgarian, and because it's where I grew up. But kind of dovetailing into like a lot of hesitancy towards moving into this, it's not that anybody who isn't involved with these processes, whether it's adopting like a climate mitigation or a climate adaptation strategy, is bad. I find it really lazy when people call other people evil, to be completely honest, but it's more about also understanding where their barriers are. Everybody wants a great outcome for their family. So starting with that point is, I think, the first step. Understanding the barriers, as Cheryl underlined, is also the next step. And getting people excited to be part of that solution is a really great way to have them actually take accountability and to own those solutions themselves.
Thanks, Alanna. That's great. And I don't know, Vanessa and Cheryl, if you want to weigh in on that one or not, or you stick with your last statements.
I can just speak a little bit with respect to the point of view of businesses. And that kind of is what my slide deck alluded to, was you have to show businesses the financial costs and illustrate with the cost benefit analysis, the cost of inaction. How much is that going to cost? It's going to cost you way more than action and being proactive and putting proactive measures into your properties. So I'm looking at it from a business point of view.
Thanks, and we like to hear different perspectives, so that's excellent. Cheryl, did you want to give what number 1 action to HRM for their accelerating climate resiliency in buildings?
Well, one thing that occurred to me is if Halifax already has a climate action plan, they would have gone to a lot of work to do stakeholder engagement and potentially even prioritization exercises like work. So there's probably already a top of mind priority. Maybe it's an area of the city that's at highest risk of flooding, and or overlaid with community members that are most vulnerable. So if that's the case, then they could focus on doing a consultation with the people in that community, saying, this is, where are you at? This is what we're thinking would be helpful. What's your perception of that? What are your priorities? How can this work for you? And I think one of the interesting things is that particularly with vulnerable populations, as a municipality can think, oh, these people need to put in, X, Y, Z, they need to do something. But when you talk to them, maybe it's not that at all. Maybe they just need to know where they can shelter if there is a difficulty, because there is no opportunity for them to make physical changes to their building or to even buy storage items. They might not even have that much money, or maybe they just they're just so beyond capacity that they can't really even think about what it is that you think is a good idea. You have to meet them where they are. So maybe if they say, we really can't do anything like that, just let us know where we should go if there's a problem. And then you can let them know about something like a YMCA hub or a neighborhood group that will knock on their door and help them. You really have to understand your audience and have a dialogue with them. You cannot make assumptions about what they need. They will tell you what they need.
Great, thank you. I'm going back to the questions from the audience. So here's our next question. Usually the prevention costs will be higher at the beginning, but in the long run it costs less. But investors tend to focus more on the initial price. How can we change that?
Actually, I think I might weigh in on this one.
Yep.
And a real privilege I have right now is that I've got some of my key clients are based in the UK. And so Mantle developments we do mitigation work, but our mitigation work and our bread and butter is really around life cycle analysis. So there can be some hesitance in terms of those kinds of building actions out in North America, but those kinds of conversations are probably about 10 years ahead in Europe right now, where it is understood that if we build to the highest standard today, that's going to be the status quo in roughly 10 years. And so those conversations, both from a physical risk perspective, but also a transitional risk perspective. And when I say transitional risk, which we didn't really talk about, it's dealing with systems around risk. So like carbon policy or having government policy switch. Those conversations are starting to happen. And as investors realize that if any of their strategy is long-term, like above 5 years, maybe boundary on 20 years, the return on investment has the opportunity to be far better if they are interested in a long-term strategy. And maybe that's the conversation, is not necessarily getting people to talk about, not necessarily getting investors to talk about like the resiliency aspect. It's embedding resiliency into the conversation about how it benefits the long-term value and long-term investments.
Great, thanks, Alanna.
That's sorry,
Yep.
Alanna, that's exactly what I was going to say, is they need to change their focus from short-termism to long-term, a long-term value, looking at it in the long term. And that goes for many, many topics coming up nowadays.
Great. Okay, thank you. What's the most important role of builders and building managers in supporting the change to improving residential buildings' climate resilience? So developers building new buildings, or upgrading, or their managers, what's the most important role they can play?
I think that's a really interesting, tricky question. And I guess it depends on what you mean by that. I think that as someone who works with builders, renovators, suppliers, one of the things they're often thinking about is, what do my clients want? How can I give them what they want for the most affordable price? How can I have value add, be competitive against, my competitors, look better. And it's tough because the public, there's not a well-developed demand from the public for, say, flood resilience or wildfire resilience or heat resilience, et cetera, is really in its infancy for various different reasons. But when I was making a presentation in BC in reference to our wildfire resilient renovation, building and landscaping guide, one thing I was talking about is, if you've got a builder or a landscaper or a renovator, you have to think about how they're dealing with their client. And if they say to their client, what do you want? They want something that's beautiful, relaxing, safe, affordable. You have to be able to give them the pitch, the framing, and the beautiful pictures, and you have to give them the materials and the framing so that they can sell wildfire resilience, flood resilience, heat resilience in a way that's going to be most appealing to their clients, because they need to make money from it and create it as a badge of honor, or a value add for their clients. And certainly you're starting to see that in commercial properties. People are getting feistier and saying, okay, if your building is, say, wildfire resilient, and it's the same, rent's the same price as that one, doesn't have the wildfire resilient promotion, or even the community is not wildfire resilient, I will not locate there. I will be in the more wildfire resilient community, in the more wildfire resilient building. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg. You need to create the awareness, but you also have to understand what their clients want and help them to frame the messaging in a way that's going to sell their products and services.
Thanks. That's an interesting perspective, really focusing on the safety and the safe investment and this competition for safe area. I suppose if you're a business and you put a lot of money into a building and it goes, you know, gets damaged, that is definitely not a safe return on your investment for sure. Anybody else?
And money is usually not with residents. It's often not the biggest motivator. It's beauty. It's relaxation, it's pride. Money is at the bottom. Safety is even usually below that, depending on the community. So listen to what your priorities are for the residents and frame it to top priority. So it's beautiful. It just happens to be affordable. It just happens to be wildfire resilient. But most of all, it's beautiful. And your neighbors will be so jealous. Go with that.
Cheryl, we're going deep into the psyche of humanity here. Okay.
I was also gonna kind of add too, like if we're thinking further down the line, like not necessarily the developers, but like people who are trades, and incorporating individuals throughout the entire process. Honestly, as somebody who's trying to build a cottage herself right now, I don't know if we can really expect to put weight on the trades because they're in such high demand. Like find it like in terms of like expecting these, like in terms of looking at construction as a supply chain, which is the hottest word of the last 2 years, the bottlenecks really are at the construction and at the trade level. There's bottlenecks everywhere, but in terms of putting the load and the expectation in an area where we don't have enough people to serve a larger community, I'm not entirely sure if that's really realistic. So that onus should, like a potential solution is looking at putting a higher onus on engineers, architects, design professionals, and strategic professionals on how you make this really easy for them to incorporate this further down the line. And that can be like simply from a materials perspective, like illustratively, maybe there could be policies to make fire resistant products less expensive at a retail level so that it's not a decision, it's instinctual that you buy the better one or the one that is more beautiful. Like you see that beautiful one is not only more beautiful, but it's inexpensive. So those kinds of opportunities can be featured through design and through policy.
I just wanted to add to that there's also many CSA standards that are developed that builders could refer to help them to remove the burden of them trying to figure it out, and just to follow a standard makes life a lot easier.
Great, thank you. Well, I see we're 3 minutes before 8 o'clock, so I know, Emily, you might have some final parting thoughts, but I wanted to thank the panelists again, and Sam and Emily, for this interesting and educating panel. And I personally have learned some great topics for our work here at Dalhousie. So thank you for that. So I'll turn it back over to you, Emily, for final sign out.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Rochelle. You've been a great moderator for this event. So thanks again. I just put again in the chat the information about EcoHack-a-City, the full program, and the other programs supporting the municipalities that Earth Day Canada has. I also wanted to thank you, the panelists, for accepting our invitation to be here today. Thank you for all your input and insights on resiliency retrofits and how to help communities get ready for the new climate reality. And finally, I wanted to thank everyone who was able to attend the public panel today and participate in the chat and the Q&A section. So yeah, thank you everyone, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.